Good morning. It's Tuesday, January 10th. It's my brother's birthday. So let me say happy birthday, Martin. Have a great day. And I'll talk to you at some point today. Right now I want to talk about the nurses' strike. Nurses went on strike at two medical centers in New York City. Montefiore Hospital in the Bronx and Mount Sinai Hospital in Manhattan. And over 7,000 nurses went on strike. I didn't realize that there were that many nurses in those hospitals. Now, I spent 3 weeks in Montefiore Hospital when I had mononucleosis. That's what they did in those days. If you had infectious mononucleosis, they sent you to the hospital. And I got sick and stayed in the hospital for 3 weeks, and that was about 4 months before I got married. So I wasn't a kid, But in any event, I have learned to appreciate nurses over the years. And I think they do wonderful jobs. I have found very few nurses in my years on this earth that have not been good people, basically. I just had a recent experience with the hospital and the rehab centers when my wife Gertrude had COVID. And she was in the hospital for 6 days, and then she was in rehab for another 7 days. And I talked to the nurses while I was there. And most of them are happy and hardworking. And they have shifts depending upon the hospital. But most of the nurses I talk to work 3 days, 12-hour shift. And then they have a couple days off. And then they work another 3 days, 12-hour shift. And maybe that's good. Maybe that's the way it should be. Then there were other people who were in attendance who weren't really nurses. They were nurse practitioners or assistants of some kind. And they only work 8 hours a day. So I can understand why nurses feel underappreciated. And I can understand why they need to get some more benefits. It's not easy working 12-hour shifts. And it's not easy being responsible for the lives of many people. So now you can understand exactly how important nurses are to the hospital based upon what I just said. And this strike has forced the health centers, Mount Sinai and Montefiore, into a frantic flurry of moving patients and diverting ambulances and to scale back on other services. And the strike is basically over working conditions, salaries, and staffing policies. Now, in my recent experience in the hospitals, I didn't see terrible working conditions. I am sure they aren't always optimum, but from the hospital at St. Catherine's, it looked like they had everything well organized, and the nurses did their jobs, and they functioned, and they managed, and they were dealing with people with COVID. And COVID is a big stress on the hospitals. I mean, when we were in there, and I was visiting Gertrude, I had to be masked, and I had to wear an operation gown, the same kind of clothing that the doctors wear when they do surgery. I couldn't leave the room. So nurses are put under a tremendous stress when there's all kinds of conditions in the hospital. And they're dealing right now with RSV and flu and COVID across the city, across the country. So the nurses are in a terrible position. You have to deal with those things. And don't forget, in the beginning of COVID, they got sick. So, they couldn't reach an agreement with these two hospitals. And when I looked at the facts of what the hospitals offered, it seemed reasonable to me, because they were offering the nurses a 19.1% increase in pay spread out over 3 years. And also those hospitals committed to 170 new nursing positions. On the nurses' side, they say they want to keep up with inflation. Apparently, inflation has eaten away at their wages. And that's true. Inflation has eaten away at everybody's wages. And then Governor Hochul steps in and says she wants binding arbitration. She wants this strike ended for 90 days and have binding arbitration. And the union says that's against their rights. They have the right to strike, and they don't want any interference from the government. They don't want any interference from Hochul. And Hochul, I think, is trying to do the right thing. She's trying to keep these hospitals working and keep the patients getting the care that they require. But I guess the nurses are fed up. It's a tough job, and they go to work every day, and they believe they're understaffed and overworked. And that's a tough thing to come to grips with. This situation has finally come to a head after nearly 3 years of fighting this pandemic that has left frontline medical workers with a deep distrust for management. And I don't blame them, because if you look at the salary differences between nurses and, say, the administrators of the hospital, there's a huge, huge difference. And something else happened. For the first time in 74 years, nurses in Britain went on strike. They went on strike over what was going on with the country's National Health Service. So there's many nurses and doctors who worked through the first wave of the pandemic and have not forgotten the conditions when COVID first swept into this country in 2020. And it overwhelmed the hospitals, and it sent plenty of nurses into the patient category. And the medical staff has felt betrayed by the administrators because the hospitals did too little in the way of taking care of their staff and in the way of preparation for this attack, the COVID attack. And they didn't have nearly enough protective equipment for these people. So when you look at the whole picture and the 3 years building up to this strike, you can see why the nurses are dissatisfied with the condition. And I can tell you, after walking through the halls of the hospital and the changes that took place in the hospital and the visiting hours, COVID disrupted their life. COVID also caused a change of thinking. Many nurses left long-standing jobs to take short-term, higher-paying assignments in medical staffing agencies. Or they just quit entirely because they couldn't deal with it. So you have all these staff shortages. And these staff shortages might be the major issue in this strike situation, because the nurses feel that they have been ignored over some period of time. So while I thought this was a terrible situation because of 7,000 workers being on strike, it turns out that it's really not that desperate, because all of the other hospitals involved in this strike, and there are many of them, have settled on the terms that were laid out. So these two hospitals, Mount Sinai on the Upper East Side and Montefiore Hospital in the Bronx, are holdouts. And we'll see what happens here. So the situation is dire. The nurses are working too hard. The staff is short. But it seems to me that the other hospitals have figured out that they're better off getting back to work. So hopefully these last two hospitals will come to the same. And I leave you with that. Bye.